In October 2024, estate genealogist Maria Rodriguez received a collection of photographs from the demolition of a boarding house in Pittsburgh's Oakland neighborhood. The three-story Victorian building had served as temporary housing for immigrant families throughout the early 20th century before being converted to apartments and finally abandoned in the 1980s. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, construction workers had discovered a cache of personal belongings left by long-departed residents. Rodriguez specialized in reuniting historical photographs with descendant families and had been contracted to identify any materials that might have genealogical or historical value. Most items were typical of immigrant family collections: wedding portraits, baptism photographs, and documentation of American milestones that families had preserved to demonstrate their successful integration into American society. One photograph from 1920 immediately captured Rodriguez's attention due to its professional quality and the apparent prosperity it displayed. The large format portrait showed a group of 11 people arranged in the formal composition, typical of successful immigrant families celebrating their American achievements. The subjects were positioned on the front steps of what appeared to be a substantial brick house with carefully arranged furniture and props that suggested considerable wealth. The group included 3 generations: elderly grandparents seated prominently in the center, middle-aged parents and relatives standing behind them, and 5 children of various ages positioned in front. Everyone wore their finest clothing, the men in dark suits with high collars, the women in elegant dresses with intricate beadwork, and the children in pristine outfits that indicated the family's commitment to respectability and social advancement. Written in careful script on the back were the words, "Rossi Family Celebration, June 1920, Pittsburgh." What should have been documentation of immigrant success and family unity would soon reveal evidence of one of the most systematic forms of child exploitation in early 20th century America. A discovery that would expose how child labor was hidden behind facades of family prosperity. Using professional magnification equipment, Rodriguez examined the 1920 Rossi family portrait with growing concern. The photograph showed exceptional technical quality, indicating it had been taken by one of Pittsburgh's premier photography studios, serving the city's successful immigrant business community. The family's arrangement followed standard conventions for formal portraits celebrating prosperity. The elderly patriarchs positioned as honored family leaders, successful adult children displaying their achievements, and grandchildren representing the family's American future. The setting on the front steps of an impressive brick house reinforced themes of property ownership and social advancement. However, Rodriguez noticed disturbing details in the children's appearances and positioning that seemed inconsistent with a celebratory family gathering. While the adults appeared relaxed and confident in their formal poses, several of the children showed signs of physical exhaustion and poor health that contrasted sharply with their expensive clothing. Most troubling was the positioning and appearance of a girl of approximately 10 years old who had been placed prominently in the front center of the composition. While her dress was elaborate and expensive, suggesting she was meant to represent the family's prosperity, her physical condition told a different story entirely. The child's hands, clearly visible as she held a small bouquet of flowers, showed obvious signs of industrial damage, shortened, partially missing fingers on both hands, with scarring and discoloration that indicated severe injury from machinery. Her posture suggested chronic fatigue, and her facial expression displayed a combination of fear and resignation that was entirely inappropriate for a child participating in a family celebration. Most disturbing was evidence that the family had attempted to conceal the child's injuries through careful positioning and props. The bouquet had been placed to partially obscure her damaged hands, and her positioning in the composition had been arranged to minimize visibility of her physical condition while still showcasing her expensive clothing. Rodriguez realized she was looking at evidence of child labor exploitation that had been systematically concealed behind presentations of family success and prosperity. Rodriguez contacted Dr. Angela Martinelli, a labor historian at the University of Pittsburgh who specialized in early 20th century child labor practices and immigrant family economics. Dr. Martinelli had extensive experience documenting the exploitation of children in Pittsburgh's industrial economy during the 1910s and 1920s. Dr. Martinelli's examination of the 1920 photograph revealed details that immediately alarmed her as both a historian and an advocate for workers' rights. The injured child's condition was consistent with injuries typically sustained in textile mills, where children as young as 8 worked 12-hour shifts operating dangerous machinery without safety protection. What you're showing me represents systematic child labor exploitation disguised as family prosperity, Dr. Martinelli observed, studying the child's injuries through high-powered magnification. The hand injuries are characteristic of textile mill accidents, where children's small fingers were often caught in machinery designed for adult workers. The 1920 time frame was significant because it coincided with increased enforcement of child labor laws that had been passed during the Progressive Era, but were often circumvented by immigrant families desperate for income and employers willing to exploit legal loopholes. Dr. Martinelli noted that the family's obvious wealth, as displayed in their clothing and house, created a troubling contradiction with the evidence of child labor exploitation. Either the family had achieved prosperity through systematic exploitation of their children, or the display of wealth was itself a facade designed to conceal ongoing economic desperation. The careful staging of this photograph suggests the family was trying to present an image of success, while hiding the brutal reality of how that success was being achieved. Dr. Martinelli explained. The injured child was included in the portrait because excluding her would have raised questions, but her positioning shows they were trying to minimize evidence of her exploitation. Dr. Martinelli recommended expanding the investigation to include Pittsburgh's industrial employment records and child welfare documents from the early 1920s, focusing on textile mills and factories that had been documented as employers of underage workers. Dr. Martinelli began researching Pittsburgh's industrial economy during the early 1920s, focusing on the city's textile mills and garment factories that had employed large numbers of immigrant children, despite increasing legal restrictions on child labor. Pittsburgh during this period was experiencing post-World War I industrial expansion, with numerous factories producing textiles, clothing, and consumer goods for the growing American market. Many of these facilities relied on cheap labor provided by immigrant families who were struggling to establish economic stability in America. The city's Italian-American community, concentrated in neighborhoods like Bloomfield and East Liberty, had developed complex networks for finding employment for family members, including children who could contribute to household income through factory work. These arrangements often operated outside official oversight and frequently violated child labor laws that were difficult to enforce in immigrant communities. Factory employment records from major Pittsburgh textile mills during 1919 to 1921, preserved in the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, documented extensive use of underage workers who were officially listed as adults to avoid legal complications. Many children worked under false names or using identity documents belonging to older siblings or relatives. Dr. Martinelli discovered that several Pittsburgh factories had been investigated by federal child welfare inspectors during 1920 to 1921, with reports documenting dangerous working conditions and systematic employment of children as young as 8 years old. However, most investigations had been unsuccessful because immigrant families feared deportation if they cooperated with authorities. The Rossi family name appeared in employment records from the Allegheny Textile Works, a major mill that produced fabrics for the garment industry. Records showed that multiple members of the Rossi family had been employed at various times during 1919 to 1920, including several individuals listed with ages that appeared to have been falsified to meet legal employment requirements. Most significantly, accident reports from the Allegheny Textile Works documented a severe injury incident in March 1920, involving a young worker whose description matched the injured child in the family photograph. Dr. Martinelli's investigation into the Allegheny Textile Works accident records revealed detailed documentation of the incident that had caused the severe hand injuries visible in the Rossi family photograph. The mill's insurance files, preserved to document worker compensation claims, provided crucial evidence about the systematic exploitation of child workers. The accident report, dated March 15, 1920, described an incident involving a worker, identified as M. Rossi, age 16, who had suffered severe hand injuries when caught in textile machinery during a night shift. However, Dr. Martinelli's analysis of the report revealed inconsistencies that suggested the victim's age had been falsified to avoid legal complications. The nature of the injuries described in the accident report matched exactly what was visible. In the June 1920 family photograph, partial amputation of multiple fingers on both hands, with scarring and permanent disability that would prevent normal use of the hands for detailed work or daily activities. Most disturbing was the mill's response to the accident. Rather than providing adequate medical care or compensation, the factory had simply terminated the injured worker and had threatened the family with legal action if they attempted to pursue compensation claims. The accident report contained a notation that the family had agreed to accept responsibility for workers' false age documentation and will not pursue further claims. Dr. Martinelli discovered that this response was typical of how industrial accidents involving child workers were handled during this period. Employers routinely avoided liability by claiming that injured children had misrepresented their ages, while families feared deportation or legal prosecution if they attempted to seek justice. The timing between the March 1920 accident and the June 1920 family portrait suggested that the photograph had been commissioned as part of the family's attempt to demonstrate their continued prosperity despite the devastating impact of their daughter's industrial injury. Medical records from Pittsburgh's Italian hospital documented treatment provided to Maria Rossi for severe hand injuries during spring 1920, with notations indicating that the family had been unable to pay for adequate reconstructive surgery that might have restored some function to the damaged hands. Dr. Martinelli's research expanded to examine the broader network of child labor exploitation operating within Pittsburgh's immigrant communities during the early 1920s. Her investigation revealed systematic practices that involved multiple families, employers, and community leaders in perpetuating illegal child labor arrangements. Italian-American community leaders, including priests, business owners, and political representatives, had developed informal systems for connecting immigrant families with employment opportunities that often involved children working under false identities or in violations of child labor laws. These arrangements were presented to families as necessary for economic survival and successful American integration, but they systematically exposed children to dangerous working conditions while providing employers with cheap labor that could be easily exploited. Dr. Martinelli discovered correspondence between community leaders and factory managers that documented deliberate strategies for avoiding child labor law enforcement. A letter from 1920, written by a community organizer to the manager of the Allegheny Textile Works, discussed arrangements for providing additional young workers who understand the importance of discretion regarding their employment circumstances. The network operated through extended family connections that made it difficult for authorities to identify individual cases of child labor exploitation. Children often worked under the names of older relatives, and families provided false documentation that was difficult for inspectors to verify without extensive investigation. Church records from several Italian-American parishes showed that community leaders had been aware of widespread child labor violations, but had chosen to prioritize economic stability over child welfare. Parish reports from 1920 to 1921 documented concerns about children missing school and showing signs of industrial injuries, but these concerns were not reported to authorities. The systematic nature of the exploitation network meant that the Rossi family's experience was not isolated, but part of a broader pattern of child labor abuse that affected hundreds of immigrant families in Pittsburgh during this period. Dr. Martinelli realized that the 1920 family photograph represented rare visual evidence of how families had been forced to balance economic survival with child welfare in ways that often sacrificed children's health and safety. Dr. Martinelli's investigation revealed that Pittsburgh's child labor exploitation had been systematically concealed through cooperation between employers, community leaders, and municipal authorities who prioritized economic development over child welfare enforcement. City officials had been aware of widespread child labor violations in Pittsburgh's industrial sector, but had chosen to minimize enforcement, actions that might disrupt the city's post-war economic growth. Internal municipal documents from 1920 to 1921 showed that child welfare inspectors had been instructed to focus on educational outreach rather than prosecution of violators. A confidential memo from Pittsburgh's mayor to the city's child welfare department, dated August 1920, stated, "Industrial recovery requires flexibility in enforcement of labor regulations. Focus efforts on the most egregious violations while allowing immigrant families to adapt to American employment practices." The memo revealed that city officials viewed child labor exploitation as a temporary necessity that would resolve itself as immigrant families achieved greater economic stability. This perspective ignored the permanent physical damage being inflicted on children and the systematic nature of the exploitation. Dr. Martinelli discovered that several Pittsburgh newspapers had been provided with stories about successful immigrant families during 1920 to 1921, as part of a public relations campaign designed to demonstrate the city's successful integration of immigrant communities. These stories consistently omitted mention of child labor issues or industrial accidents affecting immigrant children. The Rossi family's June 1920 photograph might have been part of this public relations effort, intended to show prosperous immigrant families who had achieved American success through hard work and determination. The careful concealment of Maria Rossi's injuries within the composition suggested the photograph was designed for public viewing rather than private family commemoration. Legal records showed that families who attempted to pursue compensation for children's industrial injuries faced systematic obstacles, including language barriers, legal expenses, and threats of deportation or prosecution for providing false employment documents. The combination of employer exploitation, community pressure, and official indifference had created an environment where child labor abuse could continue with minimal risk of accountability or punishment. Martinelli's research expanded to examine whether Pittsburgh's child labor exploitation was part of a broader, national pattern affecting immigrant communities in industrial cities throughout the United States. During the early 1920s, federal child welfare reports from the Department of Labor documented similar patterns of child labor exploitation in textile producing cities including Fall River, Massachusetts, Paterson, New Jersey, and Lawrence, Massachusetts. In each case, immigrant communities faced economic pressures that led to systematic employment of underage children in dangerous industrial work. The post-World War I economic recession had created particular pressures on immigrant families who faced unemployment and economic insecurity while trying to establish themselves in American society. Many families viewed child labor as a temporary necessity that would allow them to achieve economic stability more quickly. However, Dr. Martinelli discovered that the temporary nature of child labor often became permanent as families became dependent on children's income, and as industrial accidents left children permanently disabled and unable to pursue education or alternative employment. Medical records from hospitals in major industrial cities documented thousands of child workers who had suffered permanent disabilities from industrial accidents during the early 1920s. These injuries typically received minimal treatment, and children were often unable to return to school or develop skills that would provide alternatives to dangerous factory work. The systematic nature of child labor exploitation meant that entire communities were structured around practices that sacrificed children's welfare for short-term economic gains. Community leaders, employers, and families all participated in maintaining systems that prioritized adult economic success over child protection. Dr. Martinelli realized that the Rossi family photograph represented broader social and economic dynamics that had affected thousands of immigrant families throughout industrial America during this period. Federal enforcement of child labor laws remained inadequate throughout the 1920s, allowing exploitation to continue until the economic disruptions of the Great Depression forced reassessment of labor practices and child welfare policies. Determined to trace Maria Rossi's story beyond the disturbing 1920 photograph, Dr. Martinelli expanded her research to include school records, medical documents, and vital statistics that would reveal the long-term consequences of her industrial injuries and exploitation. Pittsburgh's school attendance records showed that Maria Rossi had been enrolled in elementary school during 1918 to 1919, but had stopped attending regularly during 1919 to 1920, coinciding with her employment at the Allegheny Textile Works. Her school file contained notations about irregular attendance due to family economic circumstances. typical language used to document child labor situations without officially acknowledging violations of compulsory education laws. Medical records from Pittsburgh's Italian hospital documented ongoing treatment for Maria's hand injuries throughout 1920 to 1921, with notations indicating that her family had been unable to afford reconstructive surgery that might have restored some function to her damaged hands. The permanent disability meant that Maria would be unable to perform detailed manual work for the rest of her life. Most tragically, Dr. Martinelli discovered that Maria's inability to work had created additional economic pressure on the Rossi family, leading to employment of her younger siblings in similar industrial positions. Family records showed that by 1922, 3 more Rossi children were working in Pittsburgh factories under falsified age documentation. The cycle of exploitation had continued as families struggled to compensate for lost income when injured children could no longer contribute to household earnings. Rather than protecting remaining children, families often increased their reliance on child labor to maintain economic stability. Marriage records showed that Maria Rossi had married in 1928 at age 18 to a man from another Italian-American family who also showed signs of industrial injuries. The marriage appeared to have been arranged partly for economic mutual support, as both individuals had limited employment prospects due to their disabilities. Census records from 1930 showed that Maria and her husband were living in poverty in a Pittsburgh tenement, with Maria listed as unemployed due to disability and her husband working intermittently in construction despite his own physical limitations. The long-term consequences of Maria's childhood exploitation had condemned her to a lifetime of economic insecurity and physical limitation, while the prosperity displayed in the 1920 family photograph had proven to be temporary and illusory. In November 2025, Dr. Martinelli prepared to publish her findings as part of a comprehensive study documenting child labor exploitation in immigrant communities during the early 20th century. Her research provided crucial evidence for understanding how economic pressures and social discrimination had systematically endangered children while enriching employers and supporting community economic development. Dr. Martinelli collaborated with the Heinz History Center and the Italian Sons and Daughters of America to create an exhibition honoring the memory of Maria Rossi and other children who had been exploited by Pittsburgh's industrial economy during the 1920s. The exhibition used the 1920 family photograph as a centerpiece for discussions about child labor, immigrant rights, and the historical development of worker protection laws. The photograph itself became a powerful symbol of how economic prosperity had often been built on the exploitation of vulnerable children whose suffering was systematically concealed from public awareness. Maria's carefully hidden injuries, accidentally preserved in what was intended to be a celebration of family success, served as testimony to the human cost of unregulated industrial capitalism. Modern child welfare organizations worked with Dr. Martinelli to develop educational materials explaining how contemporary child labor laws and worker safety regulations had evolved partly in response to historical cases like Maria's exploitation in Pittsburgh's textile mills. Genealogical researchers helped Dr. Martinelli contact potential descendants of the Rossi family and other affected families, many of whom had never known the true circumstances surrounding their ancestors' experiences in early 20th century American industry. The research findings were shared with labor organizations, immigrant advocacy groups, and child welfare agencies as examples of how economic systems had historically prioritized profit over child protection. Maria Rossi's story became part of efforts to strengthen worker safety regulations and ensure that modern child labor laws provide adequate protection for vulnerable children. The photograph stands today as a reminder that behind carefully constructed presentations of immigrant success often lay hidden exploitation and suffering that was systematically ignored by those with power to provide protection. The accidental documentation of Maria's industrial injuries continues to serve as evidence that historical justice requires acknowledging the experiences of children whose welfare was sacrificed for adult economic advancement, ensuring that their suffering contributes to improved protection for future generations of working children. The 1920 Rossi family portrait remains a testament to the resilience of families who survived exploitation while serving as a permanent reminder of the human Cost of economic systems that fail to protect the most vulnerable members of society.